CBRS again. I wrote a report last year and a white paper. So I've been following this closely because CBRS, it's really a technology that not only is going to be useful and it looks like very successful, or we're seeing a lot of interest ahead of the commercial deployments, but it's also the reason why it's interesting is because it sort of opens a new way to think about the way we use spectrum and the way we use wireless networks. So not only there is a potential, but it's also interesting in the sort of long term for the implications that it has. So what I'm going to do today is a preview of the report. So I'm going to go through some of the topics without getting into much detail, and the detail is going to be covered much more in the report itself, which we'll get afterwards. What I'm going to do is to first talk about sort of the basics. What is CBRS? What is going to be for the enterprise? And then I'm going to talk more about sort of the long-term implications, well, the long-term and wide-ranging implications. One thing is that I want to sort of say up front is that I'm going to be talking about CBRS for the enterprise. Clearly, CBRS is not only for the enterprise, it's also for mobile operators, cable operators, any operator, any service provider, and fixed operators as well. But I'm going to, by and large, ignore that audience because this is what the report is about and what we're talking about today, Dave and I, is why is CBRS? Why does CBRS matter for the enterprise? Another thing that I need to say up front is that I'm going to mostly talk about CBRS, but the brand name for CBRS now is OnGo. CBRS is not very user-friendly, and it's a regulatory term. It refers to a platform, to a way to manage spectrum. OnGo is a set of solutions that use that framework. But I'm still stuck with CBRS, so I'll often refer to it as CBRS, but CBRS and OnGo are part of the same, basically using the same underlying regulatory framework. OnGo is specific to LTE and then eventually 5G. So it's in the 3GPP line. Now, said that, I can get started. And so let's talk about why CBRS matter. Again, I'm going to go through a lot of this very quickly, just to give you background and perspective, and then the report will go into more detail. And the reason is because I want to talk more about the implications and have a discussion on that during the Q&A. So what CBRS does is it opens 150 megahertz of spectrum in the 3.5 gigahertz band. And what that does is, this is a spectrum that is not used very heavily, is not used heavily at all right now. And so it allows a much more efficient use of the spectrum through spectrum sharing. And by doing that, it combines both the advantages of licensed and unlicensed access because it allows incumbents to still use the spectrum. And at the same time, it opens up use to licensed users and unlicensed users. Because of this structure, it encourages both private and wireless infrastructure to coexist using the same spectrum. And this is why it's good for the enterprise, because the enterprise can have its own private networks. And it also, because of this, it will boost indoor coverage and small cells because the enterprises and venue owners have access to it. So, and it's a way to basically share the spectrum among different service providers. You can have one, the venue owner deploy a network, and then the menu owner can share that network with multiple service providers. And that's a very efficient way to use a band. And it's a way to deploy small cells without having to worry about interference with the macro network. Once you have a private network, you can also have a better support for IoT and industrial IoT applications, including those that require very low latency. Now, what it also does is it reduces CBRS, I should say here, OnGo, this is specifically OnGo, is trying to reduce the LTE complexity. And the goal here is to reach the same ease of use that enterprises enjoy with Wi-Fi, without losing the features and the capabilities that an enterprise needs. And I'll talk about it more later. It also, because it's based on LTE, it supports edge computing and network slicing. And that also makes it much stronger private networks. It then also coexists with Wi-Fi. It can coexist. It will, and will have to coexist with Wi-Fi. So it's not so much an alternative. It's something on top of it, and it's ready for 5G. And then beyond the US and beyond the 3.5, it's a platform. It's a way to think and use the spectrum that is it's new, and there is a lot of opportunities ahead of in terms of expanding the same model to other environments. And they will talk more about it, but the reason why it's such a hot topic right now is that after years of regulatory work, development, and trials, we are ready for commercial deployments. So as I said here, this is, go very quickly through this. There are 3 different users that can use CBRS. It's incumbent users that have the right already to use the spectrum. There are licensed users that will have a license. They're often referred to as PAL users. And then there are authorized users that do not need a license, but they need to be registered. And that's the difference from unlicensed band, like the ones that the 5 gigahertz band that Wi-Fi uses, that you need to be registered. So you can just use equipment that is not registered. But you don't need a license, and it's free. In order to do this, in order to allow that, you need the SAS that coordinates spectrum among users. So it's coordinated spectrum access that makes it possible. Now, in terms of the benefits to the specifically to the enterprise, is that OnGo, I should say here, not so much CBRS per se, but OnGo solution on top of CBRS allows access to LTE performance to the enterprise using their own network if they want to, with the same simplicity. And the way it works is that a lot of the complexity is sort of abstracted from the network and built in. If you can think about it this way, in the box. So when the enterprise buys the its access point is CBSD, all the functionality it would typically need is in there. Clearly, if a big enterprise wants to have a very complex network, they want to do everything in more detail, they don't have to follow that, they can go their own way. But especially for the small and medium enterprises, this is a major advantage, because they don't have to deal with the same type of complexity that the mobile operator would have to deal with. And the mobile operator needs to deal with that type of complexity because they need to manage a large network. At the same time, there is a lot of cloud-based network management that also helps the enterprise deal with the complexity that is inherent to LTE, but what the vendors are trying to do is, again, to simplify that, just use what you need and make it easier. Now, the other thing is that the enterprise, it has a lot of Wi-Fi already installed, and this is a way for the enterprise to combine Wi-Fi and LTE within their network. And there are two new enterprise-focused business models, which is private networks and neutral hosts, that are interesting, and I'm going to get into the next slide. But what this allows the enterprises to do is to have control of the network and ownership. Clearly, what that means, the downside of that is that they'll have to pay for it. But when I talk to the enterprise, that doesn't seem to really be a concern, because they benefit from the network. So it's something that they seem to be entirely comfortable to invest in a network that they can control. In the past, what has happened is that because if you cannot control the network, to invest in a network, it's a much more difficult proposition from a business case. But as long as you can control it, as long as they can get the network that they need, and they can do with the network what they need to do, they can integrate it with their local Wi-Fi, then the business case becomes much less of an issue. Now, also, at the same time, they can share the infrastructure with carrier service providers through a neutral host model. And what that means is that they have sort of the private network, standalone network, but it's also connected to the wider network. So they can sort of have it both ways. And then there is a lot of functionality which is local to the network. And I'm going to get to that later. For instance, edge computing and so on. So there are the two new business models that I talked about, private network and neutral host. The difference is that in a private network, the main goal is to support local applications for the enterprise or for the tenants that are run locally. And clearly there is a much higher level of control. On the other hand, you can have a neutral host model in which the neutral host typically owns the infrastructure but doesn't have to, but it relieves some of the involvement from the enterprise. So the enterprise still has some control, but not as much, but at the same time, it's easier for the enterprise to deploy it. Now, what I think is interesting is not so much the two extreme models, but everything that is going to be in the middle. And so in a lot of cases, when you talk to the enterprise, yes, they want to have their private network, but they also want to have the link to mobile operators, for instance. In that case, they can have a hybrid model where it might be a private network, but the neutral host is operating it. Or they can have any type of arrangements. And I think that there is a lot of opportunity there to really get the enterprise, the network it needs, with the type of involvement they need. And so there is a lot of flexibility built in. Now, let me now shift and talk about the different, the different trends here. What does it mean into the broader picture? So, so there are different things, different factors here that are already there. That's the first part of the title, and what's coming next. So typically, when you look at the spectrum, the major issue is that is the spectrum available from I'm talking from an enterprise point of view here. Is the spectrum available and how much it is? And typically, when you get to cellular spectrum, the answer is that it's not available and it's too expensive because the licenses are wide for a wide area. So effectively, the enterprise is not able to use that spectrum. Now, with CBRS, they can either as a GIA user, so general, the authorized users that do not need a license, or they can have a secondary market deal. in any case, there is some GIA use allowed. So they're guaranteed to, if they control the space where they operate, they're pretty much guaranteed that they're going to have some spectrum. So, and that's a spectrum that they have available without having to pay a license. And so now this is important because there is an increase in demand. And in order to meet the future needs, we do need to have, technology is not sufficient. So you need to have more densification, more spectrum reuse, and more efficient spectrum allocation. And this is where CBRS comes in and helps, because there is a lot of the spectrum is currently not used very efficiently. 3.5 is a good example of that. You have you have some incumbent users that do not use the spectrum to the full extent that it's possible. So this is really crucial to get more out of the spectrum that is available, and it's a limited resource. And what this is going to also help is for indoor coverage, because you tend to have, the incumbents are not using, by and large, they don't need to have an in-building coverage. So it's a great way to encourage that. Next one is the spectrum, the increased role of real estate. So clearly you need to have access to spectrum to deploy a network. And traditionally for cellular use, you need to have a license and you build the network. And this is really has been a very successful model, and it will continue to be successful and necessary, because in order to deploy an infrastructure in the wide area, because you need to protect the investment, and you need to provide wide area coverage continuously. But when you get to the densification and in-building coverage, this model is not really effective. And we can see that, for instance, with small cells, that there is clear need for better indoor coverage. There's a clear need for small cells, but to date, the market has not picked up yet. And what mobile operators have done instead is to try to improve the macro network, because small cells are really a pain to install if you do not have easy access to the venues. Now, with a technology like CBRS, you do you have sort of you go the other way around. It's the venue owners that build the infrastructure where they operate. And what this does is it really encourages that kind of deployment. And but what also means is that the ability to control the real estate, it's really crucial in deciding how the spectrum is used. So, and this is already started with Wi-Fi. So if you control, say, a factory, you're in a mining site, even better. You decide what's going to go in there. So you have control of the wireless infrastructure, of the spectrum, and hence the wireless infrastructure by virtue of controlling the real estate. So it's a very different way to think about networks, and which again, it's really complementary to the license model. You need both to have the kind of depth and width of coverage. And so what this does is to shift the emphasis and give much bigger role to the enterprise, and I'm going to get to back to that later. But it is not to the disadvantage of the operators. For the operators, it's a great way to get the indoor coverage that they need without having to spend for it. To spend money for it, and because they cannot afford it. So if you think about it, it's like with the electricity or other utilities, where you do need to have somebody that provides the overall infrastructure, but then the local electric circuits are managed by the venue owners, who have much better access to the place itself. So I think that this is really a different way to think about it. One important difference, however, is that with technologies like Wi-Fi, which are unlicensed, everybody can come in and basically use Wi-Fi. This is, like if you go to an airport, the airport might have its network, but it cannot control other people that come in with their own Wi-Fi devices. So that there is much more of an issue to manage traffic and interference. With CBRS, you don't have that problem because it's only registered users that can use it, and therefore real estate control gives you much tighter control over the use of the spectrum. Okay, now another thing is, since we're talking about the enterprise, typically what people do is that they would talk a lot about use cases and verticals. And I've gone through that, thinking about it and reading about it. And there is, by the way, there is a report by 3GPP that is hundreds of pages long and talks about all the use cases that you can use LTE for. It's a great report, but it kind of reads a little bit like I wouldn't say a phone book, but it's really interesting, but it calls the attention to the fact there are so many use cases that to just list a few sort of in a way misses the point, because yes, they're all very cool and it's very interesting. Oh, we can do this, we can do this, we can do that. But once you've done it and you convince yourself there are all these use cases that are available, and there is everything, from traditional voice on wearables, robotics, automated vehicles, and so on. And then you say, okay, well, let's look at the verticals. And well, I really have trouble finding any vertical which is not going to have a few use cases that apply to it. So I think that we need to go beyond the kind of list, because initially it's necessary to have a long set of use cases, but at the same time we have to go beyond and beyond the list of use cases and the list of verticals, not because it's not important, it's necessary, but because there is more to it. And the real opportunity, I think, and the challenge is that we need to move from the specific cases to the whole connectivity fabric. And what I mean by that is that it's the ability not only to support one device, but to support multiple devices, multiple applications, and how they will coexist in the same location. And if you look at the business case, for instance, it's very difficult to have a business case for one application, but it makes much more sense if you have multiple ones and they coexist. And this is the need that you have in a dynamic enterprise environment. That's the sort of the fourth industrial revolution type of scenario. Everything changes, everything moves. You need to be able to accommodate change. And this is why you need wireless, and this is why wireline is no longer sufficiently good, because things continue to change. And so the question is how you put everything together, and that's really the challenge. And there is a lot of technologies here, that a lot of different ways to deal with it. And this is another area where CBRS is really going to help the enterprise. And I say CBRS and OnGo actually, again, but it's not the only technology. It's ability to work with other technologies such as Wi-Fi that is going to be crucial in making sure that you can support all of these applications, because again, spectrum is limited. You need to have different bands, different technologies that work together. So we need to also move, as we move to this environment where there are multiple applications, to see how they coexist. So to say that the network can support that capacity, that latency, it's good, but it's not good enough. The question is how you break it down to different applications. And so you need to have a distributed architecture where a lot of the processing is done locally. That's why you need edge computing. processing at the edge, network slicing that allows you to prioritize and run different traffic flows and different applications separately, but also use cloud services for some of the applications that can be supported that ways, and integration between different access technologies. And this is where it's really important to understand how everything is going to, here I call it share and coexist model. And if I think of the benefits of CBRS, it's really this share and coexist mode that is going to make the difference. Again, more than a single use case can, is the ability to put everything in together. So finally, what that does is CBRS on one end makes goes deeper into the enterprise and wider, so it allows all this connectivity fabric, but also CBRS creates the opportunity for the bigger role of the enterprise to shape wireless. And this is the part that I think that there is a lot of, it's both an opportunity, but also more work for the enterprise. The enterprise is not just the customer, it's the user. It really becomes a major stakeholder. And I think that we're not there yet, but there is an opportunity. And it would be great for the enterprise to be more vocal and more present to make sure that their needs are addressed, rather than having the wireless vendors to try to guess what their needs are. So for instance, 3GPP and mobile operators have had a major role in setting the shape of wireless evolution. And I think that it would be great to see something more along those lines. And clearly not, it's not necessarily the 3GPP model, but some way to move forward. So this is all for the report, and I hope you will be able to read it when it comes out. But now let me talk about the interviews. So each report has sponsors, and the interviews, each sponsor has an interview, which is a long one. And this is part of this, I think it's the most interesting part of the report, because it gives an in-depth view of what different companies are doing. In a sort of, those are long interviews. So you get to get a lot of the insight into what these companies are doing. So one is, and these are in reverse alphabetical order. So I talked to Westel, and here the main focus was on how to make CBRS networks easier, simple to deploy. How can you buy a box, install it, and it will work? And different models in terms of how to make that possible, and they talk about their experience in that perspective. Then the next one was with Nokia, and here we talked more about the reliability that you need. This is a crucial issue. Clearly, all networks won't need to be reliable, but once you get to business critical, mission critical applications that not only need for the staff to talk to each other or to do a video call, but it really affects the way the enterprise works. And if the network doesn't work, you might have damage, you might have safety issues. It's really, reliability becomes much more important. And so I would say that more than that is the way you not only plan and build a network, but also you assess the network. It becomes different. It's not a way for people to communicate, but it's for industrial processes to keep going. And in the case, for instance, of healthcare, it's it's people's lives are on the line. Then federated wireless. Okay, this is also an important new feature and capability of CBRS is the ability to coordinate spectrum. So how do you do it? How do you get the different users to all connect and all use the spectrum and increase the efficiency of spectrum use? And this is really important, and this is sort of like understanding how this works. It's very important not only for the immediate future, but to see how that is going to evolve to different bands and different countries. If you think about millimeter wave, I think it's a great opportunity to coordinate spectrum, but more specifically in the US, the 6 gigahertz band, it's going to offer more opportunities in these areas. Is it going to be CBRS-like or not? That's a big question. But it's CBRS. It's a good first step in that direction. And finally, Ericsson, we talked about how CBRS is going to boost the small cell and infrastructure sharing in the US. And this is another important aspect that I mentioned a little bit before, is the fact that in the US, so if you look at, for instance, in Asia, there's been many more small cell deployments. In the US, we're behind, and infrastructure sharing is not prevalent in any way. And CBRS really encourages that, because you can have a single network that can be shared. And this is going to be, to make the business case for small cells much stronger. Okay, and so I am, oh no, sorry. CBRS Alliance, I forgot. And Dave is going to talk about it, so I don't need to talk much about it, there in the interview, we talk about private networks, neutral hosts, and how Ongo is going to enable that. But since we have Dave here, I'm going to let him talk. So Dave, would you like to take on?
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Monica. Just getting the deck shared here. Appreciate that. Great information, and thank you again for having me. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. I see that we've got a few colleagues on from Europe. Very pleased to be with you today. I'm going to try and get through my content relatively quickly, because I noticed there's some really good information coming in, or questions, I should say, coming in through the Q&A interface. Please keep those coming. As Monica, just took us through, there's some great opportunities for Ongo solutions using the CBRS band for the enterprises, both around private and neutral host services. But if we back up for a minute and we just look at the sort of primary identified use cases for Ongo. These are the 5 primary categories that the Alliance has identified, and I say that we've identified because I fully expect that others will emerge over time. But these are the leading ones currently. So everything from the operator-led use cases, which certainly mobile operators looking at this spectrum as a way to add density and capacity, certainly in the urban and suburban areas. Cable operators looking at this as a great opportunity to build out their own cellular footprint for their subscribers. I think Monica did a great job of covering the two sort of, again, enterprise focused, industrial focused use cases here on neutral host and then private services. And then finally on the right, the opportunity to do fixed wireless access with CBRS. Obviously, we know we've got the Part 90 incumbents operating in the band today. They're very interested in leveraging the full 150 megahertz and in also, gaining the economies of scale and mass market price points that come from a global technology like LTE, I would say. I think it's worth highlighting that these are not, sort of silos. In many cases, they overlap. In fact, we had Gordon Mansfield from AT&T present at Mobile World Congress Americas at the CBRS Alliance-led partner program there. And it was great because Gordon got up and he basically said AT&T has, plans and strategies that involve 4 of these 5. I mean, really everything except for the MSO use case is on AT&T's radar. And both he and Craig Cowden from Charter were talking about certainly the mobile broadband applications of CBRS, but then they were also talking about fixed wireless being one of the early market opportunities that they see for the technology in the band. So sort of wanted to highlight this. On the neutral host, which Monica just talked about, I thought it was worth really quickly mentioning that the Alliance actually has worked very closely with ATIS to secure a range of home network identifiers, everything from the cell site identifiers to the MCs, for assignment for those neutral host networks, so that you've got a publicly addressable or locatable identifier that's part of the global routing network, if you will. So the Alliance has secured that with ATIS. The board actually was talking yesterday about just finalizing the program to make those identifiers available to the industry for these types of applications. So that is something the Alliance is also doing to get ready for these types of deployments. So we've got these use cases which really are enabled by the 3-tier framework, and the industry response has been phenomenal. So I think many of the people on the webinar are Alliance members. For those of you who aren't, this is just a sort of a high-level overview of our membership. So we have 115 members. We've gone to that number over the last 2 years. We started off with 6 founding members in 2016. And this just represents the diversity of use cases and the diversity of opportunity in the band. So everything from the tier 1 mobile operators, the largest cable operators, enterprise wireless LAN vendors, cellular infrastructure vendors. And then I would say, over the last year or so, we've really been diversifying the membership at a rapid rate. And we're starting to add a lot of members who have a focus on in-building and enterprise commercial property management companies or integrators who focus on wireless solutions for the commercial property market or perhaps for the residential MDU market. We've added our first higher education institution. And I think, again, this really represents the opportunity around enterprise and neutral host. Looking back, doing a quick recap on what has accomplished in 2018, it really has been both a busy and a productive year. Everything from back in the March timeframe, the publication of our Release 1 specifications. And I was going to say, if you're interested in some of the work that the Alliance has done to enable both the private and the neutral host use cases, I would look at our specs, especially the network services specifications detail a lot of what the Alliance is enabling there. Going into Q2, we had probably the biggest milestone there being the launch of the OnGo brand and the OnGo certification program. So I think Monica did a good job highlighting why OnGo is important to the Alliance and what we're going to be using as our identity going forward. So that happened in May. In July, in Q3, the FCC took a very significant step and announced the initial commercial deployment process and outlined what that process would be. The SAS admins, all filed their proposals in early September. We had an interop event out in Colorado, showed great interoperability with no failures and 98% complete rate on all the test scenarios that we ran between every combination of CBSD manufacturer, radio manufacturer, and the SAS admin. So that was a very significant accomplishment. And then I think at the bottom of Q3, this was huge. We started receiving Part 96 authorizations for the CBSDs from the Commission. And then, based on that, the Alliance, in conjunction with WinForm, started issuing OnGo certifications to those products. just this last couple of months, we've seen the FCC, finalize the PAL rules with their third report in order. They announced the ESC registration process, and then we've had the FCC filing a report to Congress, which was required by law, on the status of CBRS. They basically noted a lot of these same milestones that I've got on this slide. And then they went on to conclude that the collaboration among all stakeholders is excellent. That was the FCC's words. And we certainly, are glad that that's the case. Last month, we saw the first end user device receive its Part 96 authorization. So we now have authorized infrastructure equipment. We've got authorized clients. And so what we're needing to get to the initial commercial deployments is the SASs to complete the testing process. I can only, say that process is actually going along quite well. We had a good discussion at the board level yesterday about this, and ITS, who's doing that testing on behalf of the FCC, is working very closely with the SAS administrators, and we expect that's going to conclude early in 2019, and we'll be able to get into ICD. And then ICD will be followed, we think, 30 to 60 days later by full commercial service on the band. Okay. I think looping back, just kind of closing my slides, it's worth highlighting, this is sort of a synopsis or a snapshot of the initial commercial deployment proposal of one of the first wave SAS admins, broken down into some, again, sort of use case categories. And I think what's worth highlighting here is, certainly MNO, MSO deployments, a significant portion up in the upper left. Fixed wireless, huge portion over on the right side of the slide. And this probably reflects a little bit more the sort of the number of deployers in each of these categories to a certain extent. So maybe even the MNO and MSO deployment category here is a little bit smaller. When you talk about it in terms of radios or CBSDs, it may be the largest one actually. But in terms of number of deployments, we've got MNO, MSO, fixed wireless on the right. But then, the most significant one, or at least the largest one in terms of number of deployments, is the private LTE category. So this is industrial enterprise type applications. And so, certainly reflects that there's a huge demand and a huge opportunity. So thank you. I think that's it from my side. And I think now we're going to proceed into Q&A.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dave, and thank you, Monica, for those great presentations. We're going to move on to the Q&A now. I would like to remind our audience members, there's still time to submit your questions. Please make sure that you use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen so that we'll make sure to see your question. Okay, jumping right in to our first question. Who would own and control the EPC, I think that's Evolved Packet Core, in a private network application? Dave, you want to take that?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Oh.
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Ladies first, if you want to comment, Monica. But
you go.
Okay, great. I'm going to fall back on the standard answer when you're on stage. It depends. But I think it really will depend on the deployment type. For a private LTE service, you're going to have everything ranging here. I mean, again, the broad categories for private LTE encompass everything from, industrial. So I mean, Port of Los Angeles, GE, supplied control system for a nuclear power plant, all the way down to, Fortune 5,000 enterprises potentially. Deploying this for internal communications needs. So, in that range of, what we're calling private LTE, I think the EPC deployment options are pretty broad. I think that, you're going to have some larger and more sophisticated organizations that are going to want to do an on-prem EPC, for security control, potentially latency type reasons. You're going to have others who are okay with even a managed EPC service, being hosted for them. I think that, Monica highlighted that, the simplification of the cellular solution, the LTE solution, I should say, for many of the enterprises is going to be essential. And again, I'd say there's probably some variance. You may have the Boeings of the world who have the wherewithal to tackle this kind of thing themselves, but you're going to have a lot of folks who, wouldn't know what an MME was if it snuck up behind them and kicked them in the rear. So, for those kinds of folks, you really, are probably going to be looking more at managed EPC services that can even be hosted for them, would be my opinion. And I think somebody related to that, I believe I saw a question that was about, would mobile operators, support interfaces into their EPC from private deployments? And I think that maybe was from Peter. And again, I'm not entirely sure what you had in mind, Peter. I think, if you're talking about would a mobile operator support an interface from a private network into their EPC, if they're providing it as a managed service, that is, this is an MNO managed service offering to an enterprise, I certainly don't think they'll be having an enterprise tenant, if you will, accessing their mobile core directly. And I think this is where virtualization could certainly play a role, where they could, provide virtualized instances of their EPC components to their enterprise managed service customers. If the question, so that would be, sort of the managed service perspective. If the question was more about a neutral host, or that is a private network that has been deployed now being leveraged for neutral host type services and supporting the subscribers of a mobile operator, I think there are a number of ways that you could see the interface back to the home operator, supporting that mobile operator when they're at a neutral host network venue. Everything from the SWU IPsec-based EPDG interfacing that we're seeing today with Wi-Fi calling type services, which is really somewhat transparent to the home operator other than the EPDG interface, to more sophisticated interfacing where you would have either roaming or trusted partner type interfacing, S6A, S8, or STA, S2A type interfaces. And again, this is a lot of what we detailed in the network services reports and specifications. So, I'd encourage people to take a look at those if they have more questions on that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dave. And Monica, did you want to jump in?
No, I'm fine. I think that they covered everything here.
Okay, great. Let's see, moving on to the next question. Will this technology eliminate the need for a cellular carrier to deploy equipment in a building? And what type of capacity could it support?
Okay, may I take that and then I'll let Dave comment on it. Yes and no. If you look at like a building, like a stadium, an airport, then you tend to have DAS networks. You tend to have a much more prominent role for an operator because it's such a huge and important market. So I don't think that this is going to change what's happening today, but the problem that we currently have, where there is the most pressure, is the smaller buildings and the medium-sized to small buildings. And that's an area where operators really, it's very difficult for them to justify the cost, and it's very difficult because there are so many of them. And that's where this is really the sweet spot for a technology like CBRS, because it gives you a lot more flexibility. So I think that what CBRS does is to really expand the market for in-building coverage. And again, it's not at the detriment of operators. In fact, it works with them because it allows them to have an active role, so an active agreement through a neutral host type of infrastructure to have access, or to have a sort of offload type of mode. This is what's happening with Wi-Fi, that basically carries most of the traffic today, most of the wireless traffic, and mobile operators are not paying for that infrastructure, but they still indirectly benefit from it, because if all that traffic would suddenly go onto a mobile network, they would have a real problem carrying all that traffic. So it's a question of different players, different operators serving different needs in different environments, and that's, I think, it's the way forward to accommodate growth in a way that it's cost effective and that provides the require to support the requirements in terms of performance that we need. There is one thing that I wanted to, I saw somebody was asking about fixed wireless, if CBRS can do that, and I just did recently a paper on the TCO for that, so you can get it from both the CBRS Alliance website and from Sensibility's website.
Great. And Dave, did you want to weigh in? We have a similar question about outdoor use cases like campuses and airports, that sort of thing.
Sure. Let's see. Yeah, no, this is not, this CBRS and OnGo certainly do not mean that the MNOs are not going to be deploying in building any longer. In fact, I think, CBRS opens up a whole new range of deployment scenarios for the mobile operators. Again, when we had AT&T and then also Ed Chan from Verizon addressed us in the fall of 2017, they both actually talked about enterprise managed services being one of the primary use cases and applications they see for CBRS-based solutions. So I think it's more about broadening. I think, as Monica said, it's going to take a village, in my opinion, to reach the sort of densification as well as in-building coverage goals that we're looking at for next generation wireless services. And so, no, the MNOs are going to play a huge role in building and in enterprise build-outs, but they're going to have a lot of people working alongside them and sharing that CapEx is the way I look at it. On the campus and airport question, yes, I mean, that's certainly another, very significant opportunity for private and potentially neutral host services. Boingo has announced some great work that they've already done, a trial that they've been conducting at Dallas Love Field for a number of months now, and they've, I'm trying to remember how much of that information has been shared publicly. I know they presented some of it at our alliance meetings where they've gone into some of the details on what they're seeing with the coverage they're getting from OnGo small cells that are deployed at the venue, the types of services that they're supplying to the airport for internal communications needs, and then certainly the opportunity they see around leveraging that for neutral host services to the mobile operators as well. I mean, that's a pretty natural, type of a venue for where the need for better in-building cellular is obvious. I agree with Monica's point earlier that one of the real nice features of OnGo and CBRS spectrum access is that it sort of broadens that whole market, makes neutral host solutions much more affordable and attractive and deployable by smaller entities where DAS just, doesn't make financial sense.
May I add something here? In terms of the mobile operator involvement. So here we're looking at from the enterprise point of view, but if you think about, when I was talking about the neutral host models, how they're hybrid, this is they can expand into the mobile operators, basically becoming a sort of a neutral host in the sense of building the network, operating the network for the enterprise to support their own applications, but also to open up and to share the infrastructure with other operators as well. So there are many ways in which mobile operators can get involved, even though they might not necessarily pay for the infrastructure, but they might run it, or they might pay and share it. To do infrastructure sharing over a licensed band is it's very difficult for an operator, for a mobile operator, because they have to share the license spectrum that they use for the macro infrastructure as well. In this case, I think that there are different ways in which operators can also work with each other. So they can work with the enterprise, neutral hosts, and also with each other. So I think that it gives a lot more flexibility in the whole system.
Okay, great. Let's see, next question. Is CBRS and OnGo suitable for a wireless broadband service for like a small community?
Yeah, that's what I asked. That's the white paper is about that. Wireless ISPs in rural and suburban areas mostly.
And Monica, we also had a question about that 3GPP report that you mentioned.
Don't ask me the title. I will send it out later in the answers. But if you go through the GPP, it's like use case scenarios for LTE.
Yeah, if I could interject on that, I mean, I know we probably only have a couple minutes, but there's also a GSMA report that just came out in November, I think towards the end of the month, talking about the GSMA's position on spectrum sharing. And, it's worth a read too. So I'll if it's okay, I'll include that as a link in our follow-up materials. Basically, GSMA is, indicating that their preference is certainly still for exclusive use, national type licensing, but that they acknowledge that spectrum sharing plays an important role in opening up bands that might otherwise not be available for commercial services. So I'd encourage people to take a look at that.
Okay, great. And we had quite a few questions about devices that support CBRS. Monica, I don't know if you'd like to address that in the remaining minute that we have.
Yes. So as Dave mentioned, we already have going through the certification, so we have the first devices available. So initially, we will see a lot of devices for IoT cases that will become available. But I think that the question is probably also about your typical smartphones. Will they support CBRS? And that is the part. It is going to take necessarily a little bit longer because it's not the enterprise deploys them. It's just a natural replacement of devices, which you have with every technology. So that is going to take some time, but not too long. And the replacement cycles for handsets is not too long. But the interesting fact is that 3.5 is a band that is used in a global way. It's a 5G band, and so the handsets are going to be there. There is enough interest from U.S. mobile operators. They have been pushing for it. So there will be support, and so just as a phone that supports 3.5 is not sufficient, but they just need to have the certification in the US. So it's not too difficult. So it's not going to be in January 2019, but it will happen because of the huge market for 3.5. One thing that I think it's also important to mention in this context is the fact that is authentication, and the fact that if you have a private network, you want to make sure that you authenticate the devices independently of a mobile network or mobile operator. So you need to have different ways to authenticate users other than SIM, and there's a lot ongoing for it. And I think maybe we can get Dave to talk a little bit about that, which I think is really important because you need not only a private network, but also a way to make sure you get you provide access to those that you want to control access as well. And that's something that I know there's a lot of work ongoing, which I think is going to be very important. And Dave, do you want to quickly comment on that?
Sure, I can. Obviously, there's the possibility of provision, USIMs, eSIMs to devices as well as the primary mobile operator, home operator identity. The Alliance is also looking at non-SIM based off. That's admittedly a little bit further down the timeline. To get there, you do have some DSDS devices that are available in the market today. Others are going to be DSDS enabled very soon. So I think that begins to provide some nice opportunities for the identity management in both the mobile operator context as well as a private LTE context. Typically from a handset type of a device. I think to the broader question of just device availability, I mentioned that we're starting to see the first Part 96 authorizations awarded to end user devices, and that's great. We fully expect that we'll start, we'll see some of the handsets, mostly at the flagship handset level, receive their Part 96 authorization, here in the next month or two would be my expectation. So I think you're going to see, start seeing a much broader range of device types, as well as specifically handsets coming out with band 48 support and Part 96 authorization.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, that's all the time we have for questions today. But I'd like to thank Dave and Monica for their presentations. And thank you to the audience for joining us and for asking some really great questions. The full webinar and slide decks will be available after the webinar at sensibiliconsulting.com. All attendees will also receive a follow-up email, as we mentioned, with some links. And all registrants to the webinar will receive an email when the CBRS report becomes available in the coming weeks. So thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.
Thank you all.
Thank you.